Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So today I'm joined with Gordon Stein. How are you doing today, Gordon?
Doing great. Thanks so much, Kirk.
Good. Well, glad to have you in the show. So, wanted to bring Gordon on this week because, as we, the listeners know, we've been on the edge of a recession for quite some time now, and it's going to happen any minute. But realistically, when you go into recessions, it's really good to understand your costs. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about budgeting this week. So we want to bring on Gordon because Gordon has some great tips here for people to to talk about how they can get their household finances in order. So Gordon, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Kirk. I was in high-tech sales marketing operations for a lot of years, but always interested in personal finance. And I found a lot of my people who reported to me struggling with their money. They'd say, "How do you get ahead?" etc. So I had this idea in my head. And then I found a way to get car washes for free. Crazy as that sounds, didn't save a lot of money, $25 a month. But then I found a way to save on my home alarm monitoring. And I started getting curious about this. What else is there? How do you free up more cash flow, minimal effort, minimal sacrifice? So the ideas got gathered up. They became a list. And then they became a spreadsheet. Hey, what's the future value? What if you had all these savings? What could they amount to if you could invest this freed up money? Answer was millions of dollars. So then it became a book, Cash Flow Cookbook, became a newspaper column, and I've been speaking on it ever since. A lot of opportunity for people.
So you pretty much moved away from high tech and now you're really just kind of preaching this concept to people. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's the idea. And often to clients of wealth advisors, showing them how to free up more cash, win-win for the advisor and for the client to accelerate their wealth.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of what you did, because I mean you're working in high tech, so obviously you're not hurting for cash, I would assume, at the time, and you're looking at ways to save money in your household budget. So, what's probably like the single biggest thing? If you had to do one thing, what would be the best thing that people could do to start?
The one thing was one that I missed in the first 6 printings of my book, and it's really quite incredible, and that is around credit scores and credit ratings. And often people don't know their credit score. They haven't looked at their credit rating, but it has a massive impact on their loan cost, on their car insurance cost, and their home insurance cost. So you could have two identical people, all of the things being the same. One could be spending $1,000 more a month on those 3 categories we talked about because they had an inferior credit score. And often it's due to mistakes. 80% of credit scores have errors in them. So that's one that I missed that's really quite powerful.
So interesting. So one thing that I've noticed in the past few years is even though interest rates were really close to zero a few years ago, credit card companies started to raise their rates, and now they're astronomical, even if you have really great credit. So I can't imagine what the cost would be if you have bad credit, but I know for, I've never had any issues, and, my cards have gone from like 6 up to 12%, and the other one went from like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10 up to like 24. And I have a good credit score. So does it really even matter anymore? Like, these credit card companies are just doing whatever they want, and there's really no competition. So how do people deal with that?
Well, I think on the credit card side, you're not going to get away from it. The cards are exorbitant. But if you look at other loans, obviously like mortgages and car loans, as a quick example, if you go on myfico.com and you type in a scenario, which I did, on a $40,000 car loan, the total interest paid can swing by 3-fold depending on your credit score. And this whole thing is so stealthy. You don't give up anything whatsoever. You just check your credit score, you sort out the errors, and then you reapply for car insurance, home insurance, and then any new loans going forward can see a pretty dramatic change. So there's a great one to start with.
Okay, great. No, I love that. So where would people go next after the credit score? Because I think credit scores, actually, before we get into next, I want to ask, because the credit scores are this concept that it's this, secretive process that they come up with a number. And to me, some of the math doesn't necessarily make sense, but everyone uses it. So what are some things that people can do to maybe increase their credit score?
Well, first thing and the most powerful is to get rid of the errors that are on there. So as I mentioned, Kirk, 80% of people's credit reports contain errors. Could be old credit cards you've since gotten rid of, balances that are somebody else's somehow got put on your credit report. So get a copy of your credit report. They're free. You can get them through your bank or through folks like Experian. Take a look at it and get the errors resolved. They're obligated to resolve errors when you notify them of errors, but they don't normally have an incentive to make sure these reports are pristine and error-free. So there's an opportunity to get that would be the first thing to change. Then it gets a little bit more involved to take a look at how to improve it over time, but on-time payments matter. The credit mix of the kinds of loans that you have matter, outstanding balances, all of these things play a part in it. But it's just worth building. Step one is, I would say, build an awareness, have a look at your report, see where your score's at. And if your score is not great, if it's below, say, 700, there's going to be a big opportunity for savings to make those changes.
Okay, cool. So, one thing I noticed, and we talk a lot about this in the show, is that everyone seems to be doing fine. They talk about we're going to have a recession or we're in a recession, and yet everyone seems to be operating like it's not a recession. And yet, what I noticed, I don't know if you noticed this, but the outstanding credit card debt has gone through the roof. It has just skyrocketed in the last 2 years. And I don't know where the limit is, but if I'm paying 24% interest, my limit is 0. I am not paying 24% interest on a credit card. So I don't carry any debt because, before you could, if you're paying 4%, I'll carry debt. Why not? But 24%, I'm certainly not carrying the debt. So, but there are people who are. So, how do people handle that? Because it's going to be becoming an increasing problem.
Yeah, I mean, that is where you do have to give up some things. A lot about my book and what I like to speak on is how do you get something for nothing? How do you free up cash flow, to pay things down? But you also, to your point, you have to deal with your own psychology. If you're the sort of person who rings up credit cards, doesn't get them paid down, you're going to have to bite the bullet and get out of that debt, particularly coming into recession. There'll be a possibility of job loss, et cetera. So grinding those cards down is a huge priority, and then work your way down to the other high interest loans you may have. Could be car loans, et cetera. But I'm totally with you. There is just no reason to be carrying credit card debt. 70% of millennials right now permanently carry a balance, and that is tragic.
So, I find it to be challenging because I know growing up, my dad taught me how to use credit cards responsibly. Basically, if you don't have the cash, don't use your credit card. So it was like, you want to buy something, but you need a credit card, because the problem now is you're forced to use credit cards for virtually everything. So, it's just a natural part of society, whereas growing up, it was more cash. But if I want to buy something mail order, I needed a credit card, or I needed to mail in a check, which means I had to wait longer. So, but he said, hey, if you're going to buy this thing for $500, give me $500 and I'll put it on my credit card. Right. So there was a bit of responsibility there. But if you're looking at, now you're forced to use them. So it's really hard for people to manage that. So do you have any kind of like tactics on how people can kind of think about that?
I think just greater awareness and looking at those statements all the time. You can see it all online now. And most of the online things, you can actually use a debit card. So that's an easy shift. And then you're living more within your means. But really take a look at it. And it becomes a lot more complex when you have a partner, because you have two people charging on the credit cards. But having a meeting with yourself or a meeting with your partner every month, where am I at? Do I have the money to pay it off? And when do I need to cease fire on the spending? Just critically important. 24% interest, 26, 28. There's just no getting away from that. That's a 5-alarm blaze in your finances. First place to start.
Okay. So, all right. So credit cards, I think, we all know that's not a great place to be, but what are some other things people can do to save money? You talked about some of the things. You said you saved in car washes, but like, on a day-to-day, if I look at my budget, there's tons of different line items and expenses that I pay every month. So what can people do to start saving, on a monthly basis, not just like one time, but like, ongoing, without spending a ton of time on this? Because I don't have time to do this.
No, nobody does. I think the whole key is those recurring monthly expenses. So what I talk about in the book is you start off with a list of all of those things that come out of your bank account every month, all of your automatic bill payments, which is your utilities, your taxes, all of those kinds of things, your various forms of insurance, cell phones, cable TV, everything. All of those numbers can be ground down to size. So It's a matter of taking a look at each of them. Some of them, like what we talked about with credit scores, they're kind of stealthy and there's actually nothing to give up, which makes it a great one. All you have to do is do a little bit of research, make some changes, get rid of the errors. But everything else, there's steps that you can take, which I detail about how to grind down each and every one of those bills. Give you a personal example. I moved into a 1938 house here in Cleveland, Ohio, which are not known for their energy efficiency. And this is a extreme climate. It's real hot in the summer, real cold in the winter. But I was able to slash my annual consumption of electricity by 50%, 50. So that's a really big deal. My last electricity bill was $64. So, it had been just short of $200 for a lot of the months when I first moved into the house. So a handful of simple changes, drive down the electricity bill, some conservation kinds of things, same kind of thing with your gas bill. So there's a great place to start. It should be an easy $100 or up to $200 a month that you can easily do. If you have a vacation property, you can double that. So there's a quick starting point on those bills.
Well, give us some examples of how you're doing that. I mean, I want to hear how get some examples exactly how people can do that.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of the energy bills in our home, a couple of changes we made. We actually happened to be doing a kitchen renovation. So new appliances made a huge difference with actually a surprisingly quick payback on things like a dishwasher. So dishwasher is using gas to heat the water, probably electricity to run the motor and the thing, and water consumption. Versus the old one that came with a house, that was a dramatic savings right there. Obviously, things like LED bulbs can make a big difference. And depending on how you're doing your heating, setback thermostats can save another 5 or 10% right there. A big one we did in our old home was insulate the attic. My wife and I did it ourselves, probably took about 3 or 4 hours, took about $600 of insulation with a dramatic drop in both our heating bills and cooling bills. That was probably the biggest thing that slashed the electricity bill and slashed the gas bill. So gas bill down about 35%, electricity bill down by 50%. More details in my book, but happy to take you through all of that.
So insulating the attic really drove it down that much?
It's the biggest single thing you can do. The other one is getting rid of all the breezes around doors and windows. So you can take a lit stick of incense or a candle or something where you see those breezes, a little bit of weather stripping, probably $10 a door. In my case, I was in my workroom in the basement, which has a door out to the garage, and I always felt a little chilly in there. I took a look at the door. There was a 3/4 of an inch gap below the door with the ice cold garage air coming in all the time. And of course, the hot air coming in the winter. Never even thought about it. If you take 3/4 of an inch, you multiply that by a 30-inch door, it's like having a 5-inch hole in your wall. Imagine. And that's not the only one that I found. So it's just a matter of systemically going around the house, putting in these thresholds, some weather stripping, do it yourself, get somebody to help you with it. But you're going to be paying for all of this stuff for the next 30 years or however long you're in your house. So that air infiltration is a huge one.
So I know I know at least in Massachusetts, there are some companies that will go around and check your house for this sort of thing. Do you recommend people use companies like that?
Yeah, an energy audit is a great place to start. I'm an engineer and I'm pretty handy. So, I get right into this kind of thing. Lots of people don't have the time and don't want to bother, don't have the skills. Get an energy audit. Usually your gas company will do them. Might be $100. Well worth it. They'll give you a stacked rank list. And in many cases, there's government incentives to pay the bill to make the changes. But that's a great place to start, particularly if you're going to be in your house for 10, 20 or more years.
So government incentives is pretty interesting, and those are the kind of things I think most people don't even know that exist. But there are other government incentives that people can kind of look up, because I know when I lived in the city, they literally came through the building and said, how many lights do you have? And it was like, how many LED bulbs can we give you? And it was like, I don't know, I got 100. Like, give me LED bulbs. I'll take as many as you give me. So, what are some things that can be done to help saving and maybe get more money from the government?
Yeah, the incentives will vary by state, but there's a whole slate of new ones that came in fairly recently. And the best place to go is probably your gas company website, or you can just do some Googling on government incentives in your state. But I know here in Ohio, there's ones for upgrading windows and doors, appliances, et cetera, heat pumps, all those kinds of things. But in order of savings, I would start with air infiltration. So stop the air leaks where wind's whistling in and around, get some caulking, weather stripping going. LED light bulbs are the biggest no-brainer ever, particularly on your 10 most used bulbs in the house. That's a pretty easy way to save. And again, if you take all of this and you look at the future value, invest in the savings at 7%, it's massive. You know, people retire, 64% of Americans retire with less than $10,000. It's stunning.
I've seen that stat. It's kind of scary. And I imagine with inflation, it'll probably only get worse. So what, all right. So that's for energy. Obviously that's a big piece. Personally, I hate my cable company. You know, we have these deals in Massachusetts where they negotiate with the town. So the town only has one cable provider and they're awful. Worst customer service ever. But how can I save money from them? Because I really don't want to give them any more money than I have to. But what are some ways people can get access to better internet or cable at a cheaper way?
Yeah, I mean, the big one I think is on the entertainment, on the cable TV side. Internet, you shop around speeds and feeds and away you go. I think there's some interesting opportunities right now. Things like YouTube TV. I don't get commission on any of these. YouTube TV is pretty interesting. It's $70. Gives you live TV. Take a look at the channel lineup that you're interested in, and that's something worth comparing. Another big one, depending on your city, if you're in a major metropolitan area, you can do a lot with these new high-def antennas, incredibly cheap, one-time cost of $60 or $100, get that mounted. And now there's great interfaces on smart TVs that give you a whole channel guide, and it's absolutely free once you buy it. And that might satisfy your need for the things you want. And if there's specific things you want, an NFL Sunday ticket, or you want to watch F1 racing, subscribe to the app, $5 or $10 a month. And can you pull together something cheaper? It's worth taking a look. If it was $100 a month difference, which is not hard to find, that adds up pretty significantly.
What about things like phones? I find with cable, if I go in August and beat them up a little bit, they get the best deals. But like, what about phones? What can people do to reduce cost of phones?
On the phone itself, not a ton, particularly if you're in the Apple side, the iPhone side. If you're in the Android side, lots of room in terms of getting better pricing on phones. But what I would do is definitely do a cell phone plan comparison. So that can be a pretty significant difference there. As an example, I use T-Mobile. I made the switch, no contract, and the pricing is dramatically better. So I've got 5 lines for $170 a month, which I think is pretty cheap. So doing that kind of comparison could vary a bit depending on the area that you're in. There's some online tools. So if you Google cell phone plan comparison tools, a whole bunch of them will come up. You can use those, put in your data utilization, et cetera. But most of them are unlimited now. And do a comparison. What are you paying? Are you paying a lot more than what I just suggested per line? If you are, time to go back and do a reshop.
Okay. So you also mentioned transportation costs is a big one. So how can people save on transportation? I mean, pretty much nowadays you have to drive everywhere. So what can people do?
Yeah, tons of things that you can do. I did a fun experiment. I did a blog post on it. I tried varying my speed, 75 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, 65 miles on a lengthy trip. Did it both ways, averaged them out. The difference between 75 miles an hour, I think was down to 65, was 42% difference in fuel consumption. So setting your cruise control, even 4 or 5 miles an hour down, makes a massive difference. You see these gas buddy sites where people are talking about, the gas is going up 2 cents tomorrow, it's going down 2 cents tomorrow. To me, that's preposterous. Who's got the time to track it? What are you going to do? Go fill up your car? But a change in driving habits makes a really big difference. The speed is one, speed of acceleration, the degree to which you're braking, all those things, just getting a little bit smarter about your driving habits. There's an interesting Edmunds piece on this, difference of about 35% just by changing driving habits. Makes a huge difference. So that's a big one. The other thing is people particularly have way too much car in their driveway. And what I often see is you'll have a couple And let's say one partner has a pickup truck, one has a minivan because they've got 5 kids and they need, lots of capacity. But they don't always have 5 kids. Could you have one smaller vehicle for commuting and one bigger one that's kind of the family hauler? So depending if you're going to make a change in your vehicle or if you're stuck with the vehicles that you have, then maybe it's a bit more about driving habits, getting a little bit smarter that way.
So you mentioned, the speed 65 or 75. What was your conclusion?
Well, the difference between the two was 42% savings on fuel. So when I did that,
Which way though?
Pardon me?
Which way?
Oh, faster uses more fuel.
Yeah. Okay.
By a long shot. Yeah. So, having done that exercise myself, often I'd find myself, I'm driving at 78, 81 miles an hour. I just set the cruise now at, 70 or 71. Maybe I get there 10 minutes later. What are you going to do with the 10 minutes anyway? Right. So listen to your podcast while you're driving. And,
yeah. Take as long as you want.
Yeah. Why not?
Listen to it all day.
The time isn't that critical.
Okay, cool. So, as we kind of, look at this, I mean, obviously financial literacy is a big challenge here in this country as well. I mean, we talked about some things that people can do to save some money, but I think one of the biggest challenges we have is financial literacy. We've had a few guests on in the past to talk about it. But it's not something I learned growing up, and it's not something that most people are teaching their kids. And it's probably one of the biggest challenges we have because people start with credit cards in college and they're constantly bombarded with offers, and people don't know how to manage their household finances. So what are some tips you can give the listeners for how people can manage their finances?
I think a big one is I would listen to your Money Tree podcast is fantastic. Read a personal finance book a month. Keep learning about it. There's every aspect of everything you do financially, there is a better way to do it. If you look at things like 50% of Americans shop their car financing, only 50%. The rest take the first offer that they hear from the dealers. Well, that could be a difference of thousands of dollars. The average car loan duration is 96 months. So just getting a little bit smarter on all of these things, because it comes up in so many different ways. But, credit is one interesting area. Learn to understand credit. Every kind of loan can get shopped, just like you can shop for any kind of commodity. And when you're going to make a purchase, I would carve it into, is it a want or is it a need? And both of them are fine. But if it's just a want, I'd give yourself a 48-hour cooling off period. You're excited about something, give it a little time to actually need that thing. And whatever it is you're buying, I would do the research, $35 a year, consumerreports.org, before you buy anything, a car, a dishwasher, a household appliance, a water heater. You hop on there and you just check, are you getting the best value? Then you spend a little bit of time shopping around for price. You can use an app like Cookbook as an example. And right when you're in the browser, or Honey is another one, it's popping up saying, hey, actually, I got a better deal over here. So getting a little bit smarter on all of these things right across the board is just a pause before you buy anything. And it's a run through of particularly a run through of all those monthly recurring expenses, get them all ground down. And then the real punchline to me is this idea of saving 10%. Most people say, I don't have the money to save 10%. Well, you do. It's hiding right there in plain sight. You grind down all of these bills and you get that money to your wealth advisor. Better still is 15 or 20%. And yeah, everybody can absolutely do that. Minimal effort, minimal sacrifice.
Yeah, I went through an audit of my own financials a bunch of years ago for every single reoccurring thing, and just negotiated every single line item and looked through and said, how can I beat them up a little bit and reduce the cost and reduce stuff? And, it took a little time, but it was well worth it. I would save myself a lot of money just on a recurring basis. And if nothing else, it helps you rethink your habits of what you're spending it on. And we certainly talk about this with clients, but I think it's definitely more of a personal thing, like what you're spending your money on. I don't judge, like spend whatever you want. But at the end of the day, if you're not doing it for yourself, because you can't have somebody else do this for you. You need to do it for yourself. You need to sit down, understand where you're spending your money, understand where you want to spend your money, and, figure out what changes need to be made. If you need an extra $100 a month, then figure out where you can save it. But going through the process is, I like this phrase, the process is the goal. right? Going through the
Mhm.
process is what is going to be valuable, not having somebody do it for you. So I think it's not something you can outsource, but if you do it yourself, I think you'll find a lot. So any kind of final thoughts you can leave us with here before we wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. A couple quick things. One is I would say typical people who hear me speak, read the book, they're saving, I would say $500 would be a bare minimum a month, $1,000 would be more typical. And the whole point is minimal effort, minimal sacrifice. So everybody can do it. And I'll leave one closing example. It's a pretty interesting one, probably the most interesting one I found when I researched the book. And that is we only ever wear 20% of the clothing that we buy. And most people object at first, say, no, you don't understand. Well, in fact, you do. So do a closet clearing out every year, for the yard sale, for the charity, whatever, and you'll see it's true. We shop to shop. We don't shop mindfully. So there's a great example. But I think the best advice is start with that credit score idea, go after all of those monthly recurring expenses, free up that cash flow, and do something productive with it. If you're carrying that 24% credit card debt that we talked about at the beginning, get rid of that. That's a 5-alarm blaze right away. Once you've got that pared down, then I would get that money to your wealth advisor. Make sure you've got a good one and get that money working for you. And the difference at retirement can easily be $1 million, maybe $2 million, all with minimal effort, minimal sacrifice.
Great. Well, Gordon, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us. Where can people find more about you?
You can go to cashflowcookbook.com, which is where my blog is. You can get the book there. You can also get the book on Amazon in whatever country you're in. There's a US edition, there's a Canadian edition, and it's packed with ideas to help you free up that cash flow. Takes it through step by step, minimal effort, minimal sacrifice. And it's a good way to drown proof your finances, make sure you're saving in all those possible areas, and get that money working for you.
Great. Well, thanks again, Gordon. And, we'll put all that in the show notes for listeners who want to learn more about the Cash Flow Cookbook. We'll put that there. So thanks again for joining us, Gordon.
Real pleasure. Thanks so much, Kirk.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute. But before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right. Well, that was a great interview with Gordon. Really appreciate him coming on the show and sharing his wisdom with us. Now we're into the panel portion of the show. We have our very own Megan Gorman. Hey, Megan.
Hey, Kirk. How you doing today?
Doing great. Doing great. We also have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk, how are you?
Doing awesome. All right, let's just dive right in. So Megan, what were some of your takeaways from this interview?
I really liked the fact that it's a lot about the basics, right? I think when you're in finance, we often forget, because we talk about things all the time, like budgeting and credit scores and so on, that most people don't speak that language on a daily basis. So what I really enjoyed about this was sort of listening to him talk about some of the basics. And funny enough, I was listening to it with my husband. And, in every marriage, and you guys are married too, right? Like there's always a little debate on some of the financial stuff. So there were a couple things that came up in the interview that I think gave my husband some sense of satisfaction. And in particular, the fact that he talked about the YouTube subscriptions, because that's been a battle with me and my husband about some of our subscription stuff. But more on a more serious note, I think the fact that he wants you to be present with your spending, with your finances, is something that, regardless of your net worth, really is something that applies to all of us. And that's what truly resonated with me.
Great. And Phil, what about you? What are some of your takeaways?
So I agree with what Megan said about being present. And a lot of times we talk about budgeting. And when you talk about budgeting, a lot of people take that kind of like as a 4-letter word. Nobody wants to hear it. But it's not just about budgeting. Like if you don't want to budget, don't, but know what you're spending. I kind of blogged on this topic this week, where I talked about some things to help you with managing your spending. And it starts with, I tell a story, but when I bought my first house, I wasn't sure that I could afford it. So I decided there's only one way I'm going to figure out. I got to know what I'm spending. I wasn't trying to budget, but I just carry around a piece of paper. And if I bought anything, I wrote it down. And at the end of a month, I took all that and I put it into a spreadsheet and I looked at what I was spending. And by doing that, I said, well, if things get tough, I know where I can cut my spending so that I can still do this. So it's about that. And it's about, like, when he talked about different ways to cut expenses, like the idea that look at your bills, right? Get your credit card statements out. What are you subscribing to? Are you using it? If you're not, you don't need it. Story Carl Richards tells that he got his bill and he looked at it and he had this fee for online on the internet access on an airplane. He said, do I really need that? And then he looked, and he hadn't taken a flight in like 14 months. So obviously that was a good thing to cancel. So like, that's the thing. And then turn it around, and instead of spending the savings you have, save it, because it's an easy way to increase your savings too. So it has a lot of other effects.
Yeah, that lifestyle creep, right? Like, it's funny, you bring up like when you first bought your first house. And I remember when I first bought my first house, it was in Hoboken, New Jersey. And I had this very tight budget. I was like 26 and I had $25 if I wanted to go out, which would allow me to take the PATH train into the city, have one cocktail, because this is 2003, and be able to get home, right? And I remember being like, and I think about that moment now when I'm in a restaurant or bar and I order a second glass of wine or another cocktail, not too many cocktails, but and I think about the fact that there was that moment of sacrifice that let me achieve the ability to buy a house, which, but for buying that first house, I would not have had some of the positive financial experiences I had. And I think the thing is, I find that when we're in our 20s, we're really good at this budgeting thing, right? Because we're trying to start out in life. I think one of the things that I struggle with, and I see others struggle with, is, in my late 40s, lifestyle creep is so easy to have happen, right? I mean, sometimes because, especially like both my husband and I, we work, sometimes I joke, I'm like, we just throw money at problems because we DoorDash or we Instacart because neither of us can get to the grocery store, right? And it's a really bad habit that, I think the type of mindfulness that we're talking about, Phil, and what you wrote your blog about, I really think it's something I need to reinstitute back into my life on the lifestyle creep, because it's really, really easy to have it happen. You add a couple of kids, a dog, and, people working, and it's easy to have happen. And then I go back to that moment when I'm 26 with the $25, and it's just like, okay, I need to be that person again sometimes.
I think it's interesting because, when you think about money, I mean, money is basically a tool that you can use to buy back your time. And, what you're talking about, Megan, like DoorDash and things like that, like, I think a lot of us, we get lazy, it's just normal, right? If you have enough money, you get lazy with stuff. And then eventually it just, as you said, lifestyle creep. It just becomes who you are. Like, oh, I got to get a dog walker. I got to get, DoorDash or whatever. Like we tried to get our groceries delivered until we realized that they do a really crappy job at picking out good groceries. And oh, by the way, here's a list of things, and you didn't buy any of it because none of it was there. You couldn't find it, so you substituted, and I don't want any of it. Like all that stuff. Like I think there's an element of, do I really want to spend 2 hours at the grocery store? Not really. So I'd rather just pay someone to do it. And I think we've become a society where those conveniences are a really helpful part of our lives to buy back our time. But on the other hand, it also costs money, which means you have to work more. So I think it's an interesting element of, as I've kind of realized, like I remember when the internet became a thing. Technology, late 90s, early 2000s. Oh, technology is going to change our lives. It's going to free up more time. We can do all these other things. What happened? We just end up working more. So it freed up time for work, so it wasn't really freeing up time for the things we wanted. All it's done is made us more efficient at working.
And I think your quote is really important there, Kirk, buying back your time, right? As I do think as you age, right, you do feel you have less time from both a longevity standpoint and a day-to-day standpoint. So I do think that's how you rationalize expenses. I think you put it together really well in that issue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely something that people need to be mindful of. And I think as long as you're mindfully doing it, it's okay. But I think, as you said, Megan, the lifestyle creep is the problem. And Phil, I'd love to hear kind of more stories. I know you wrote an article about this this week, but the lifestyle creep's important though. Subscriptions, all these things that we have, and we're like, why am I paying for this? And sometimes, like, for instance, like ESPN, like I don't really watch sports that much, but I watch hockey and my kids do. So we buy it for the hockey season, then we turn it off, right? Because I'm never going to watch it. I just don't use it. But during certain periods, it makes sense to use it. So Phil, I don't know, what are your thoughts on all this?
So first, on the idea of buying back time, one of my favorite stories about this, because I looked at it more logically. When we moved into the house that I'm living in now, I bought the tractor from the woman that owned the house before us. I said, I'm going to cut the grass. And so I started doing it. It was taking me 3 hours and I wasn't even finishing. The only thing that was good about it is my kids liked it. So every week that I do it, a different kid would sit on the tractor with me while I did it. And then my wife found somebody that could cut the grass for $40. And I'm, let's see, it's taking me 3 hours. I'm not finishing, and somebody else will do it for $40. I know my time is worth way more than $13 an hour. Please let him do it. Right? Like,
Was
that's
he taking 3 hours too?
Oh, no, not at all. He had I sold that tractor, and the guy that bought it from me looked at it and said, I can see why you're selling this. It's not big enough for this lot. So when he did it, it probably took him like half hour, 45 minutes, because he had a better tractor to do it, or whatever kind of lawnmower he had, right?
You
So
clearly don't live in California, because we all have really small lots here.
I do
My
not.
friends from Jersey come to my backyard and they're like, where's the backyard? So
Exactly. It's funny you both talk about that. I talk about that with my wife too. Like, we're making more money now, but we're spending it. So why aren't we saving as much money? Because lifestyle creep happens, and you have to be careful about that. You have to watch and not let it just run away, so that you spend whatever increase you get in your savings. It's really important to keep an eye on that and be mindful of it. That's such an important part of all this, is mindfulness.
well, one of the things he said, and it sort of relates to mindfulness, is, and it was interesting listening to the interview with my husband sitting next to me, because it was like having my own little commentary running. He
Peanut
talked about
gallery.
something that, I do with a lot of clients but I don't think about a lot, which is shopping for car loans. Like how he mentioned in his interview that most people just take what the dealership offers them, right? And I do think, a lot of times when I have clients going to buy a car, I'll send them to like a Capital One website, which you can sort of punch in your info and at least get a quote on what the rate would be. And I think that also goes to this idea of time, right? I think if we pause, we're probably able to make better decisions on things like car loans, or shopping our mortgages, or looking at credit card rates and consolidating at a 0 rate credit card for a period of time, right? Those are some of the things that I think really if you're going to be mindful in personal finance, spend the time on those things, because those little things all add up. Because again, if you shop your mortgage and you're able to save 1/8 of a rate over 30 years, that's real money. It really is.
Yeah, that's such a good one, the mortgages, because I know when COVID hit and rates fell, and I talked to my clients about maybe you should refinance. I'm like, oh, I'll call whatever bank it is. I'm like, whoa, let's not just do that, because they're probably not going to give you the best rate. And I had a guy that was a broker that I referred to, they liked him and he got them a better rate. And so it's not just the fact that they saved by refinancing, they also saved because when they did, the costs of refinancing were less, the mortgage rate was better. So it's important that you look at what your options are and not just take the first thing that comes across the table.
It's interesting because we've had such a long period of low rates that I think most people just kind of gotten lazy because it's easy. Like, oh yeah, you can, like you said, the car dealer, like, yeah, they're offering you a great rate and maybe you can save, 1/8% going to your bank or somewhere else, but it's like, it's like, oh, I've got to go do all that work. Right. But now you can save a whole percent. Like it's, the spreads on interest rates vary so much. I mean, I talk about this on the show and how, I look at like 2 credit cards that I've had, long time credit cards. My credit score is great and no problems. And you got these 2 credit cards and just watching them, like one was like at the low was like, forget it was like 6, like 5 3/4. It was really low. Like it was the lowest I've seen. And I think the other one was like 12. Like that was the lowest they were giving. And there was a point in time, maybe 5, 6 years ago, they went to like 7 or 8. But they, like they raised it a few years ago. Maybe it was right around COVID. And now they're like as high as they can go. Like they're literally like, 20, 25%. I think that's the limit in Massachusetts. Like they're as high as allowed. And I call them and like, what's going on? And they're like, yeah, this is the lowest rate we got. I'm like, really? Like, you sure? They're like, yeah, this is literally the lowest rate we got. We are not giving anything lower. And I'm like, what is going on here? And so to me, if you're shopping around now, the other car that was 6 is now up to like, like 10 or 11. That's still so much better. Right. And I'm sure there are cards out there that give good rates, but if I look at, I've got a bunch of cards I never use and I look at the rates, I'm like, Jesus, all these cards are so high and I don't even use them. And so I can imagine what everybody else is doing. But the point is you're talking about like, 25 to 11, huge difference. Like I don't need to use that 25 period. They obviously don't want my business because I'm not, I pay them off every month. I'm not even going to spend money on that card because they're clearly not looking out for me. So, F them and, fun, that's the word fun, not the other. But anyway, the point is, I think now because of the higher rates, it pays to shop around. It pays to look at these different rates, compare and contrast. And I think what we'll find is a lot of things that we've taken for granted over the last 15 years now makes sense to actually go back. And I think to the point that both of you are making, like it's been so long that we've done this that people they're a little rusty. Like people are rusty on their not necessarily their budgeting, but in their household finances, their home economics or whatever you call it, where you really, it pays to shop around. I mean, people aren't clipping coupons, but they're certainly looking around at rates and saying, how can I get this cheaper? So, Megan, we were talking about before the show that one of the comments that came up was like credit card versus debit card. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the difference. I try to explain it to my wife. She uses debit cards and I try to explain it to her and she still uses debit cards. But, can you explain the difference between debit and credit cards and why people should one versus the other?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, debit cards, as you know, is you're basically accessing your bank account, right? Taking the money out directly. Whereas a credit card, you're technically borrowing the money, right? So the big issue with fraud and is that both will help you if you have fraud on your accounts. Both credit card companies and your bank with the debit card company will help you. However, it will the timing of how the help and getting the money back in your account happens are very different processes. It is much easier with a credit card for them to give you back the money. Whereas with debit card fraud, right? First of all, depending on when you report it, there will potentially be some liability on your part, right? So according to the law, you've got about 60 days to report a lost or stolen card. And, if you go beyond 60 days, there's no protection on debit cards. Now, if you alert them early on that you've had fraud, they will get your money back. However, it does take time. So it's not usually the wisest thing to use debit card on a day-to-day transactional basis. It is far better to use your credit card because you will get your money back quicker. And Phil and Kirk, add what you want, because it's a complex area. It's not an easy area of fraud.
Yeah, go ahead, Phil. I got a lot to say, but go ahead, you first.
So one thing I'll add, I think it was last fall, my wife went to New York City to see a play with a bunch of her old high school friends. They all had a big birthday. They went to celebrate together. And one of her friends had a debit card in her wallet, and that got taken. And there was other information with it, and they were able to access her bank account. So it wasn't just using the card for purchases. It was also that they took the maximum amount of cash out that they could on the card as well. And it was a much more costly scenario for her because she had the debit card and that's what was taken and that's what they used. And think about it, the person that took it probably used the debit card first because they know that it's a little bit easier to get away with it and they can get cash, which is much harder to get on your credit card too. And the other thing to think about is a lot of times the credit card companies give you better protection on the items that you buy. So it's not just the fraud, it's also you buy something and there's a problem with it. You're going to get a lot more help from your credit card company than you are going to get from the bank if there's a problem with something that you bought. So that's something else that I like to keep in mind too. And then go one step further. When I have a credit card, you pay your bills off and fill. Find a credit card that gives you some type of rewards. You get rewards on a credit card. You're not going to get them from your bank on a debit card. So there's a lot of things to me that, I've had this conversation with my son, like, Dad, why do you use credit cards? I'm like, because use credit cards. If I use them responsibly, it's a good thing. It helps build my credit. I get compensated in some way for using them, and I get more protection from fraud as well as if there's something wrong with the item.
Yeah, it's, I mean, all these are great points. I mean, personally, I have very strong opinions about it. It's, my dad taught me this when I was younger is, obviously building credit's important and doing it responsibly is important. I think young people, it's like crack for young people. They're just like, oh, look at all this free money. And then they pay it back and, it takes a while to do so. But I think so in some ways, maybe for young people, debit cards would be better because it's more, when I was doing it, when I started, when I was really young, I was buying things through catalogs because that's what you did. There was no internet. So you look in a catalog, you buy it and you're like, oh, well, they need a credit card or a check. I'm like, well, a check means I got to mail it, means an extra few weeks. I'm like, no, I want it now. Right. So I'd use a credit card. But my dad's rule was you have to give me the money and then I will order on the credit card. Meaning like I had to have the cash. I couldn't just pay it later. And that was a great rule. I thought it helped me be responsible with credit cards and understand them. But I think they're very dangerous when people are young. The downside to like using a debit card for young people is you're acclimating people to the use of a card versus actual cash. Cash reinforces the fact that you've got cash or you don't have cash, right? And if you don't have cash, you can't spend it if you're using cash. With a credit card, and our whole society is built in credit cards right now. So I'm not saying it's practical, but I think there are a lot of people out there that really espouse that you shouldn't use debt at all. Debt is bad. Debt is terrible. Well, it's terrible if you can't control yourself, right? Which it is an addiction. I will say for a lot of people, shopping can be an addiction. So if you can't control yourself, then yeah, debt's probably really bad for you. But I think for most responsible people, and I'm not saying most people are responsible. I'm just saying for the people that are responsible, using a credit card makes things easier. And as Phil said, you can get points, if you pay your balance off every month, find a card that gives you cash back, gives you points, gives you something, because these credit card companies are charging the retailer between 2.5% and sometimes 6% of the purchase. That's what goes to credit card companies. That's their fee. So even if they don't make any money off you, they're making money off the purchase because the retailer is paying them. So if you ever see these gas stations or give you two price, a cash price and a credit price, that's the reason, because it costs extra to use credit than it does for cash. And so understanding that dynamic is really important. Now, if you're carrying a balance, and I wouldn't recommend doing that right now, you're going to have to pay a pretty penny right now, 10% plus, and it's going to be hard to make that up somewhere else. So I would recommend not carrying a balance if you can. Now, the point that Megan and Phil made is probably one of the strongest points of using a credit card is the liability protection. If you're carrying around a debit card, and this happened to my wife, she had a debit card and there was fraud on it. No one stole her card. It was just fraud, right? These companies, whether it's a card reader or in a store in a Target, there was an incident in Christmas time, like 5 years ago, where a bunch of people put fake swipe readers in Target stores and they got a bunch of numbers. I mean, this stuff's happening, whether it's happening through your use or just through the banking institution. I mean, banks are the target internationally for fraud, cyber, and otherwise. So you have to understand that this is a big deal. And if you use a debit card, you're not liable, but you kind of are. It's one of these gray areas, as Phil and Megan said. It's just a matter of time. It could take you weeks or months to get your money back, right? We talked about the FDIC. The FDIC guarantees your money up to $250,000, but they don't tell you when. Could take you a year, right, to get your money back. So same thing with debit cards. It could take a while, right? The banks are getting better than they used to be, where they'll pay it back quicker, but still they can stymie you if they want. They could just say, oh, we got to wait to get it back. And now you're stuck not having that cash if you need it. Credit cards, hey, wasn't my purchase. You just call the credit card and say, fraud, it's not me. And they take it off right away. Immediately take it off your card. You don't have to worry about it. It might take them 2 or 3 months to detect where the fraud came from and to go, do all that stuff. I don't care. It's not my problem. They only put it back if it's determined that it is mine, right? Now, obviously, I'm not telling you to say it's not yours if it is, because that is in itself fraud. But as long as it's not yours, just say, hey, it's not mine. You don't have to pay it. And they take it off and they remove it. It disappears. It's kind of like, and I want to touch on credit reports here for a moment. Credit reports are the same thing. You should at least once a year look at your credit report. Get it. It's free. They're required to give you a free credit report at least once a year from each of the agencies. So go to all three, get a credit report from them, and look at it and determine if there's any erroneous things on there. Many times there are. You'll find an erroneous charge that's not yours, or it's a delay in payment or whatever. It's a mistake. All you have to do is write them a letter and say, this is not mine. This is inaccurate. And they will take it off. And then they have to go back and they have to research and determine if it's true. If it's true, they put it back on. But most times they just take it off and you never see it again. Now, I had a friend who played a trick on this, and this is a secret that I'm going to share, a deep, dark secret of the credit bureaus, that if you understand how this works, you can save yourself money if you have credit problems. This is not for most people. What some people would do, and I've never done this, but saying some people that I know have done this, is what they'll do is, if they have credit problems in their past, is they will write a letter to the credit bureau and they'll say something along the lines of, I don't think this is accurate, please remove it. And it's up to them to remove it. And then they have to research it and then determine if it's true or not. Technically you could say that's a gray area of writing that letter of saying, I think it might be inaccurate, but they would do that. And what they would do is they do it around the holidays. And so my understanding of what happens in the credit bureaus around the holidays is they will take huge piles of these things and just push them and just say, yeah, this stuff's fine. And they'll throw it in the trash because I got to get through this stuff. And it's the holidays. I don't want to do work. So stuff would just magically disappear. So these people would do this in the busy season, and then stuff would just disappear off their credit. I had a guy in the show maybe 3 years ago. We were talking about this issue, and he confirmed it. But these little tricks like that, you're not really. I'm not suggesting you do this. I'm not telling you to defraud people. I'm just saying this is what some people have done, and it's worked. And so, just claiming there might be an error in here is not inaccurate necessarily, but you're obviously in the gray area. So my point is understanding the system is really important, because the system is meant to both protect you and take advantage of you. So if you understand how the system works, you could kind of work around some of these issues, like the credit bureau, checking it once a year and just saying, hey, this is a problem, and they remove it. It's like if you get a bill in the mail that's inaccurate. I got one last week. I got a bill from one of my kids' medical institutions that I paid, and their billing is terrible. It's always been terrible. And I looked at my records because I keep records for this very reason. And I looked at my records, say, hey, I paid it in this date, called the billing agency. Hey, I paid it. And they're like, well, we don't see record of it. I'm like, well, here's the record. Here's the amount. Here's the date I paid it. Go figure it out. And I got a call a day later, like, yeah, you're correct. We remove it. But how come these errors are never in my favor? They're always in their favor. What's going on? Like, I never get an error in my favor. I'm like, oh, how nice. I don't have to pay that $500. Nope. Never. So it's, maybe there's something to that. I don't know. Maybe it's a big conspiracy to defraud people en masse, but I feel like there's never errors in my favor. They always catch the ones that are, but anyway, so let's get into some final thoughts here as we kind of wrap it up. Megan, what are some final thoughts you can leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, this was a good interview about the back to basics. So I really encourage people, when you think about the basics beyond what he talked about, is, think about personal finance as a consistent growing education of yourself. You're never going to know all the things you need to know about finance because you're constantly evolving. So your money is constantly evolving. So find really good ways to continue to educate yourself. I also would remind everybody to protect themselves, right? Insurance is something people do once and then they don't ever look at again. But on an annual basis, take a look at your property and casualty coverage and make sure you have an umbrella policy. And then the last thing I would tell you is, it's always about tax. Tax is like a foreign language, right? I'm not expecting everybody to speak it in the same way that we as tax practitioners do, but really engage with tax. Don't treat it as something that doesn't impact you, because it does. And there are ways to find savings in tax. So I'm Megan Gorman. You can find me on Instagram at All the President's Money. Kirk, thanks for having me on. Thanks for
coming on, Megan. And Phil, final thoughts from you.
I think the biggest thing about personal finance is mindfulness in general. Pay attention. Megan just mentioned insurance. It's not just looking to see if you have enough coverage. I also tell people every couple of years, go out there and get new bids, because you know what's going to happen? You start and they give you this low rate to get you started. And then it creeps up because nobody pays attention. If you go out there and get somebody else, get other quotes, you'll get your rates down. So sometimes it's about negotiating, right? I think during the call mentioned with the internet, like you can call your internet companies and see if you can get your fee lowered. You tell them, I'm going to go. I mean, it's a little harder sometimes with that, but it's just always being mindful, pay attention, look at your bills, because there's mistakes made all the time. And on taxes, I love that point, because I always tell people, first of all, taxes and investing are joined at the hip. Second of all, don't just wait till it's February and it's time to give the documents to your tax preparer to think about taxes. If you think about taxes ahead of time, you can save a lot of money, especially as you do that transition from when you're saving for retirement to when you're retired, because there's just so many things that you can do. So that's another area and another way that you can save money that wasn't even touched on until the end of this, but something you really want to pay attention to. Make sure you plan. So I'm Phil Weiss. My firm is Apprise Wealth Management. I blog every week. You can sign up for my blog on my website, apprisewealth.com. And if you go to apprisewealth.com/ebook, you can download my free ebook. Thanks for having me, Kirk.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.